welcome to another episode of Alaska Commercial Real Estate Today. I'm your host, Phil, and joining me today is Alaskan economist and commercial real estate appraiser, Lydia.
Good morning.
Well, we have a great show this week, and let's see, we'll be discussing a national trend, which is affecting Alaska. We'll also discuss an Alaskan trend, and then we'll follow it up with a discussion about highest and best use, a foundational appraisal concept that a lot of people don't understand. So hopefully we can bring some clarification and education to that.
Yes, I agree that highest and best use is a foundation of the appraisal process, especially in the commercial market.
Yep. If you screw up the foundations, the whole rest of it's going to be screwed up as well. So you got to get the basics right. What's happening nationally, Lydia?
According to JLL, wrecking balls are swinging at struggling retail properties nationwide. 1.2 million square feet were demolished in the fourth quarter 2022.
Of commercial real estate.
Commercial real estate. So retail space, a lot of them are enclosed typical malls. But also to that, I mean, there are those open air type malls.
The California concept, right?
Correct. So actually 3 million square feet of open air shopping centers were demolished last year.
Interesting.
So that's coming after in 2021, there was a time 1.3 million square feet were demolished. Now, of course, this is just not sitting vacant. They're demolishing these properties for redevelopment.
Yeah.
So it's kind of a changing of times, if you will. A lot of these are older properties built, in the heyday of the malls.
Yeah, the 90s.
80s, the 80s,
90s
to 90s.
And 80s.
Yeah. So it's a lot of that is just due to the age and also to the design features that are no longer what retail tenants want or consumers want.
Consumers, yeah.
So it's the enclosed mall, unfortunately, has died.
What? I think the large question for everybody is, will we get more zombie movies before they tear down all these malls? Because it's kind of the thing is, before you tear down a mall, you film a zombie film in it.
Right, exactly. Well, I mean, they can be repurposed, and in some cases that might be what happens is that the space is repurposed. But in a lot of the areas in the lower 48, they're just being razed. Yeah.
Yeah, and it looks like that's probably going to happen here in Alaska too. There's one in Kenai that's ready for demolition. Do you know the percentages on how much of that space is still habitable?
Usable,
I mean, they lost their federal tenant due to maintenance issues.
Yeah.
And then they've got some state tenants and some other defunct, but a good portion, maybe half or better, of that mall is unoccupied, unable to be occupied.
Right. It's questionable whether the cost to repair and to remedy maintenance issues is justifiable anymore.
Yeah.
Based on, what its current use is. So it's prime for redevelopment for sure. It's a larger parcel, so there's certainly can be other uses applied to that.
Well, if Sandra's watching, we love our mall. We have our corporate headquarters located in a mall.
Well, professional centers are, it's kind of different. That would, it's not considered typical retail, right? So professional centers are kind of
well, that's the pivot. That's the pivot that a lot of these malls are making.
Right. And, so these properties are being redeveloped with mixed uses, meaning there's multiple types of use. And one component of that is residential, as well as retail and some office or other type of use. There's Wasilla property that is in the beginning stages of that. They're looking to add senior housing and some, multifamily type housing in the same area as these typical retail centers to a more mixed use type of community, I guess.
Well, you did an attempted redevelopment of one of the malls in the Wasilla into a church, and then did they end up selling later, or did that just not happen? I don't remember.
particular use did not happen.
Okay.
And then
it got raised.
Then eventually that property did get raised, which then became a big box store with out parcels and out.
So in some cases in Alaska, people are raising their flat roofs to solve roof collapsing. But in this case, when we say the word raise, we mean R-A-Z-E, which means to demolish. So if you don't know, don't feel dumb or stupid. I probably forgot to. But we're saying raise. They're raising the property.
To level or
leveling
to raise,
for redevelopment. Yes. That's what that means.
And that's, again, can be more cost effective in the lower 48. In Alaska, it
often isn't.
It isn't often.
Sometimes it is.
Sometimes it is, but a lot of times the cost to renovate or remodel is less than.
Well, a lot of times what we see in Alaska is these, like a large big box store will have a life, right? That it starts off as perhaps a nicer retail, and then it goes to more warehouse style retail still. And then from there, it'll go to another maybe industrial use, as in storage or warehouse, and then from there sometimes it goes down even further, that they'll start parking vehicles and using it for actual storage. And so we have this lifespan before these buildings get raised, and then every once in a while we'll have a large tenant like Home Depot was one, took over the Kmart, another property you did. The Kmart turned into Home Depot in Anchorage. Let's see. I'm thinking of the Fred Meyer built in Palmer, but then they became U-Haul, but still they weren't quite defunct when U-Haul bought them. But for whatever reason, Fred Meyer wasn't succeeding in the space they were in, and that was due to some political issues in Palmer. So they had to build new across the highway, which was kind of an interesting swap. Safeway.
Yes.
Fred Meyer, and then they pivoted Safeway, Fred Meyer.
Right.
And then U-Haul came in and put self-storage and vehicle storage, heated vehicle storage in that space. So that was an interesting redevelopment.
Right. Yeah. So we're also seeing some other big box stores that's similar situation. The Pier 1s that recently closed in Fairbanks and Anchorage have been repurposed.
Sports authorities
have that were repurposed.
Yet to be discovered if the redevelopment in Fairbanks of the Pier 1 will succeed or not. I don't want to throw out the new use yet. I'm not sure that it's even happened yet. I don't want to pretend like, because we were privy to that performing the appraisal. I don't know if that's public yet or not. And even if it is, I don't know if it's going to succeed. So
I'm not sure. Yeah, but that was our repurpose of that property. We saw the one in Anchorage being repurposed to a gym, and then also a sports authority that was repurposed to the Sam's Club, the similar types, into Goodwill actually goes into those kind of spaces. So
Goodwill is one of those that will come in and be kind of a lower tiered use, that they can facelift it for their purposes, and it's acceptable to that type of client. Another mall that got repurposed in Alaska along Muldoon in Anchorage, the state went in there with the job center, and that was a mall prior. That was a big walk around interior mall.
It was,
well, right?
It's a Boniface area.
Was it Boniface or Muldoon? I don't remember.
That the city and the state now have offices in, instead of it being mostly retail.
Yeah.
So it transitioned with some facelifting and.
Well, Mongolian barbecue's right there, so I don't know why they're not succeeding. It's the best Mongolian barbecue and only that you can get in. Not in Alaska, but in Anchorage.
They fry it up in front of you.
Yeah, it's kind of fun. It's a fun thing. It's done so well in other places, and it's done so not well here. We don't know any better. Let's see. So what other kinds of large developments? So we've seen converting. So the trend happened pre-COVID. We already had these large retail and commercial spaces getting redeveloped. I'm thinking about, was it Ferguson's? Moved out, and we ended up doing the appraisal on that one.
Right.
What did that get redeveloped into? It was a great building.
A portion of it became a bar, but I'm not sure that the whole entire
I think that
space
was a non-arm's length thing.
I don't think the whole entire space has been reused.
Okay, so still vacant. I think you
So-
appraised that somewhere around 4 years ago, so it's been a while.
It's interesting the changes happening. I mean, some of these malls where they're losing their typical retail clients are getting some of these entertainment type of uses, which is like the Dave and Buster's
Yeah.
or virtual golf and
High-end Chuck E. Cheese.
right. So it's
If you're an 80s kids like us,
right. So
Chuck E.
some
Cheese
of those
was
uses
the
we're
was
seeing
the
here
thing.
locally. We're seeing that.
Yeah.
And also in Anchorage, we've seen that some of the retail spaces are being reused for a more
Up-to-date version. We have a fun center in
yes,
Kenai,
that
but they
kind of
got
thing.
built from scratch. Of course, they came from Wasilla and did not use the local commercial real estate appraiser. Just throwing that out there. So if they fail,
that's a national
why.
trend that they're kind of these
Pivot the space.
into entertainment tenants, they call them, that
Okay.
are not actually, they're not restaurant, they're not retail, they're this other kind of thing that's
Which is segues into the move away from malls. So interior space malls, often those would anchor large malls. And I'm thinking of Diamond Center. And they used to have that type of a client there. And now I'm not sure what the main draw is there. I think it's still probably the theater, Best Buy, and the ice rink.
they have some major national tenants there that
They have the Army recruiters. That's probably what it is. Those Army recruiters
Old Navy.
are doing well.
so that there's still some draw from some national tenants. I think Baskin Robbins is still there. It's,
I thought we all went to Cold Stone up here.
well, Cold Stone's kind of changed their model too. But it's Alaska's in general are pretty ingenious in finding some kind of use for
Yeah, we'll figure out what
for
to do with
space,
it. I wonder
yeah.
what they're going to do in Takotnu. So big news out of Anchorage this last week is the Regal Cinema is pulling out, and they built that cinema
they did.
to go in there. Got developed about the same time as that's Bass Pro, right? Bass Pro, Lowe's. Who else is there? Burlington Coat Factory still, or Best Buy is there?
Burlington went somewhere else, but yeah, it's
There's a brewery. There's some. So
restaurants.
they got a good mixture.
Sam's Club was there at the time, and
There's
they're
a
being repurposed.
Is there a Home Depot or it's just Lowe's? Is there two? Or maybe it was Costco. Anyway, there's some big box, great anchors. Interesting to see Regal pull out there.
It is because those type of shopping centers really do rely on different types of uses, different types of tenants to bring people there. So the draw would be that you go to the movie and then you go to the restaurant next door, or you go shopping. So it really does kind of hurt the synergy, they call it, in these shopping centers when you do not have a good mix of use. Yeah. So, restaurants like to locate next to uses like a movie theater or a large shopping complex because they know that there's already that draw. So they have that many people coming into the shopping center from that they can potential customers, right?
Yeah.
So.
Well, I've noticed that there's a lot of synergy that goes with the Workforce Alaska places. So everywhere that they're located seems to have a bail bondsman located next door. And then no one else. So they're good for killing them all.
Yeah.
I guess.
So,
I hope they're a good tenant. I hope they pay a lot of money because they seem to kill the rest of the businesses in the area, with the exception of bail bonds, Oh, my. So that's the big news then, Alaska, except that you have recent, I don't think we've talked about it yet. There's one mall in particular that has made the news just today and yesterday. Tell us about what's going on up in Anchorage with the Northway Mall.
Well, the Northway Mall has now been renamed North Point, and it has a new owner.
Okay.
Safeway closed their store, and that was located there in 2020.
That was a great Safeway.
And Burlington has moved. That was located there.
Yeah.
So since those things have happened, the interior tenants were evicted.
My favorite cowboy store was there.
Yeah, I remember that store. So
I got hats and belts and jeans from them.
There's only, 3 tenants there and they do occupy some large space, but basically it's
Exterior
listed for
only.
sale. Yeah.
Yeah, and it's been for sale in the past,
Right.
And they've been trying to pivot in, within mall purposes, and they just haven't been able to get it done with any of the Anchorage brokers. So, interestingly enough, it's not marketed in Alaska, and they're not using Alaskans to market it.
No, it's listed with a national firm, and it's listed as a redevelopment property. It's not listed as you would typically see as occupied and operating at a certain level, right?
Yeah.
Because their income that is minimal at this point. It is listed as come do what you want with it, right? So it's
very prime real estate.
It
It
is.
is an important corner. It's right off the approach end of the prominent direction for landing onto Merrill Field. I have flown approaches over there hundreds of times. And as a student at the flight center there at UAA, when I was going to school there, I would go over to the Safeway and get food, and then go spend money we didn't have at the Cowboy store. So later they got a Red Robin, which happened after I was gone. So that's sad.
right.
But and we know people who've worked there. In fact, we knew a gentleman in Anchorage who worked there nearly his entire adult life and retired out of that Safeway. Yeah. So there's a lot of history there, but
There
it
is,
is
yes.
not just to view as you on final approach into Merrill Field look at it, but at the Glen Highway, which 80% of the people who work in Anchorage commute right by it, right?
Right.
Anybody driving in from the valley goes right by that location. The exposure is phenomenal. Some of
Yes,
the
it
best
is.
exposure in the state of Alaska, and
it is
arguably the country.
a large parcel too. So
It's over 30 acres,
30
right?
acres, yeah, and it's for Anchorage, that is a considerable amount of space for
They don't have a lot of land left,
right prime, like you said,
That's
prime
not
real
swamp.
estate. That's right.
or homeless camps. Yeah. Right.
So what's interesting though is this agent.
Or snow dumps.
Well, that's what everyone wants to see as they drive down the highway, right?
Yeah. Well, yeah. So it's great real estate, and unfortunately, we won't get a commission if we bring the buyer. So I'm not going to point you to the broker.
Right.
If you're a buyer, hopefully you are listening to our show. But no, that's interesting because it's an example of another mall in Alaska being raised. There's several of these in Fairbanks as well. So not just Fairbanks, but we've seen anywhere where there was a Sears having from the 60s through the mid 90s, an extremely prominent position, vital to Alaskans. And when Sears died, Alaska was one of the last places that they pulled out of.
Right. The Sears in Anchorage is now an Amazon warehouse.
Okay, one of them.
So that's
the Sears warehouse.
The Sears warehouse, right?
Yeah.
So that's the
Sears store is now a Guitar Center.
Yes, yeah.
And Safeway got
So that whole mall did get a overhaul. Essentially,
I think Guitar Center saved them.
Yeah. So it's and Safeway only really kind of moved. So they moved out of the space they were in and into a newer space. But that mall is doing well. Now, the only question with that is with the merger of the grocery store chains,
which is yet to be approved in Alaska, at least, right?
Yeah. The last I heard is they're still working out the plan that needs to be approved. The Fred Meyer is right across the street. And so technically they would be then the same company. And so they might make a choice to close one of them, possibly, or
we'll see
potentially.
What happens. Yeah,
right.
That's a number of communities in Alaska are going to struggle with that decision, and we're going to be interesting to see what happens. So the last Safeway merger with cars did get slowed down and was not fully approved, and had to make some concessions to work in Alaska. So that may happen again.
Yes.
Palmer again.
Right.
Dueling large box stores right across the highway from each other on the Palmer-Wasilla Highway.
Very true.
And
yeah.
Again,
that was another
on the
location.
same Glen Highway. So, large stores and communities depending on both. We'll see what happens there.
Yes, and I know a lot of the Alaska senators have spoken out against it because of the fact that it would limit choice and competition in Alaska. So especially for us when we have limited choices already.
You're gonna drive everybody to Walmart.
Yeah. So it will be interesting to see how that plays out. Of course, they're already talking about what areas they would be closing stores, and most of those are in areas where they have a lot of large overlap in California and places where
out west.
Alaska really doesn't really register a lot of times because
They don't talk about us.
such a small
That's
market,
fine.
but we're
I tried to order shoes today from, a very large retailer who I will not name, and they don't ship to Alaska with free shipping or any shipping.
right.
I really wanted those shoes, so.
Well, and it's because they think that it costs $3,000 to ship to Alaska.
I don't know. So, that's frustrating. So I lost my train of thought on the other store I was going to mention about that, but redevelopment, again, malls changing, pivoting. Fairbanks, I think, got hit a bit harder. There's been some really, really large retail spaces that have been vacant for a long time. Again, Sears being a prime example. It was one of the very few malls in Alaska that had multiple stories. Was the Sears Mall in, there was two, right? Two Sears malls in Fairbanks. Again, I think one was actually the warehouse, and then the other was their mall. Did you ever get into there? I know you appraised property all the way around it. I don't think you ever actually appraised that one.
Yeah.
The surgical center nearby there. You did.
Right. There were some restaurants, but no, I have not even the large space there.
Yeah. Well, it was like traveling back to the early 80s.
Right.
So, I mean, realistically, that's why they failed, because they never upgraded the decor. Mirrors everywhere, pink and coral were the prominent, salmon. Right. Must a lot of salmon colored, pink. So that's probably why they failed. But Fairbanks has still lots of vacant space from those warehouses that have not been redeveloped.
Yes,
and they're falling apart.
Right.
So we'll see what happens. They're going to probably get raised.
Yeah, eventually, the cost of renovating and is too much that it just building new becomes the highest and best use.
The highest and best use. And we hinted at last week that we have been hired by a client to do Kenai Peninsula Borough area. I think that's as close enough. Mall on a smaller scale mall. And the potential developer is looking to completely pivot the space, bring it up to modern, lots of things,
right? And
hoping for the best. And so we're still analyzing whether that's feasible or not.
Right. Yeah. So that's the other issue when you look at this is what type of tenant you're going to draw, and if that changes the rent that you can receive for that space.
And can you get to that rent and cost to make it pencil?
So there's a lot of key components you have to look at. The operating expenses of the property is one. The type of tenant that you wish to attract, dictates how you renovate your space. Office, though, is one of those spaces that is difficult to renovate to achieve higher rent.
So if the build out was hard walls, right, enclosed offices, that's a lot to unbuild out.
Right.
If the build out was cubicles, then it's much easier to clear that out and turn it into something different.
Right.
But that was not really the theme in Alaska. Cubicles cost so much money to get here, and they're not manufactured here, that actually the majority of office spaces here don't have a lot of cubicles. They actually build walls. So again, cost of construction
that dictates a lot. Retrofitting for sprinklers, retrofitting for commercial kitchens. I mean, there's a lot of things that have extreme cost that would allow for different use, but in some instances you're not going to achieve that rent in order to justify the expense and the front end.
Yep. Property in Soldotna, within recent years, I'm trying to remember how many it was. I think it was within the last 2 years, lost their tenant because the fire department finally did shut them down for not meeting safety codes based. And there's not a lot of code enforcement in Alaska, especially outside of Anchorage. But the most basic of fire code did finally get them shut down. And the owner of the property chose not to do the upgrade, felt it was more cost effective to let the tenant leave and let the space go dark than to do the
retrofit,
upgrade to retrofit in the required fire sprinkler system.
Right.
And so again, that's an indicator of a property that is headed closer towards the raise and start over for redevelopment than the retrofit to keep the lights going.
Exactly. Right.
So,
and again, operating expenses is a big component of this. One of the reasons that these enclosed malls, especially, don't pencil anymore is the expense of the common space that has to be heated and maintained. And, there's extreme costs to that, especially in Alaska. So,
unfortunately, our energy costs are some of the highest I'd say in the nation, but it's actually in the globe, for various reasons. Partially because we like to shut down, clean energy sources like, hydroelectric, and instead borrow from afar burned coal. I don't know. It's not their money, so they just keep raising the price. That's what our co-ops get us. So the cost of those utilities, and in Fairbanks, what has been huge, these big warehouses going vacant because they can't heat them, because they're still, the majority of them are heating with coal and diesel heating oil.
Right.
So oil and coal are some of the most expensive sources of heat. Outside of electricity, electricity is just not even feasible at all in Alaska. We cannot heat with electricity here. So those spaces go dark because it doesn't make sense to heat them, and they can't get anyone to occupy them even for free if they have to heat it. So.
Right. Yeah. So that's a considerable cost in very cold climates, especially, further north you get in Alaska,
it is.
And more extreme.
They were promised natural gas. And so that's something we've been watching closely because the EPA has come in and forced the Fairbanks North Star Borough to enforce a bunch of smog-related actions. And they've actually outlawed wood heating stoves outside of a certain modern type. And so there's mass noncompliance. But if you're running commercial spaces, not a lot of commercial spaces heating with wood, but when that came down, what was promised was a natural gas development. The lines did hit Fairbanks, and the city of Fairbanks spent, who knows, untold millions of dollars spreading natural gas lines throughout the city. And none of them are running yet, or are they? I don't think they've actually started.
I believe there's just a small pocket.
Boy, talk about expensive.
Yeah.
A lot of people spent a lot of money to upgrade, and then Instar did not come through in the way they promised. So that's a tough one.
It is, yeah. And that, especially that Fairbanks is on the rail belt of Alaska. It's unfortunate.
A lot of coal is happening up there. So it's interesting. You go back a couple hundred years to find places that heat primarily with coal. And here we are in Alaska. So we still got a coal mine running strong. And, the good news for a lot of Alaskans is you can walk along our beaches and find coal naturally.
Yeah.
It's a natural resource here that washes up on our shores. So it's a lot of work, but take your kids to the beach and have them gather coal to heat the house through the winter, I guess. I know that's been a thing in the past for some Alaskans in rural locations. So do you have anything else for us on the Alaska front? What's happening?
No, I mean, really, it's that's a really large listing, large space, potentially could be completely raised. The listing indicates that some buyers have considered relisting or releasing some of that space, or converting it to another use instead of a complete tear down, because it is a very, very large space.
Safeway put a lot of money in about 10 years ago on a pretty large renovation there. We also saw portions of the mall about 15 years ago where the common spaces were retrofitted extensively, and they moved a bunch of walls around and reconfigured. Used to be the Alaska Boat Show was there. So
that's true, yeah.
It was a very common thing that most Alaskans are familiar with that mall because the Alaska Boat Show was there every year.
Right.
So what's interesting to me is that the owner is choosing to go outside of Alaska to market, to appraise, to finance, and everything else.
It's honestly, when you get to this large scale, when you're talking about national tenants being located on property, it's not uncommon. But
we're seeing large investors, commercial investors, leave Alaska. And so that's the concerning trend is some of this large money is leaving Alaska for more lucrative and business-friendly locations.
Right. Well, and kind of the recession that we spoke to of Alaska prior to 2020, which is continuing, it does not look good. Typically when you build new, you expect to achieve a certain rental rate.
And return. And Alaska's kind of falling behind on being able to achieve that in most markets. Anchorage has kind of always been the exception, being that it's the largest city and they can draw those national tenants. But it's not always the case, especially when construction costs rising. The national tenant model of stores changed a lot as well. It has.
And so, Alaska's not the boom area that it once was. Not to say that there isn't any,
we have strong markets. Toke's doing great and developing and building, and Fairbanks is still seeing the types of business that cater towards the crowd that is there. So the Fairbanks crowd is not, they're not changing. It's the dynamic of the population there that is the same. It's just that the numbers are growing in the military side. All of Alaska and all of our country is changing demographically in age and retirees and generational, right? We've got some numbers shifting around, which is another thing we've been talking about. And so those that are positioned to take advantage of that are doing so. And the face of commercial spaces are changing in the meantime, which I think segues perfectly into our Ask an Appraiser segment this week, in which we decided to discuss the concept of highest and best use. So a foundational appraisal concept, as we alluded to at the beginning of the show. But Lydia, why don't you talk about what is highest and best use? What are the aspects that are looked at? And then why are you and I both saying that it's such a foundational concept for appraising?
Highest and best use, as defined by the Dictionary of Real Estate Appraisal, is the reasonably probable use of a property that results in the highest value under the four criteria. The four criteria being legally permissible, physically possible, financially feasible,
that's important,
and maximally productive.
Which you would think would go in with feasible, but maximally productive.
It can segue into that. So this kind of leads to a better definition and kind of encompasses this is what the most probable use is. So most probable use definition is the use to which a property will most likely be put to based on a market analysis and highest and best use conclusion. The most probable use is the basis for the most probable selling price. So that's what we're saying is the foundation of the value of a property. So the most probable use is determined by the highest and best use analysis, which helps determine the market value or the most probable price.
Right. And so in the listing package for the Northway, whatever they want to call it now, North
Point.
The used to could have been Northway Mall. The agent marketing has said that the highest and best use is unknown.
Undefined.
Undefined.
Yeah.
So as if it's yet to be figured out, or
right.
anybody's guess at what it could be.
A lot of the legally permissible, which is zoning typically.
In Anchorage, that's a large consideration.
Well, sure. So based on zoning, right, there's a lot of commercial uses that could be developed there.
And without giving away any free work to this large marketing firm, we're not going to do their highest and best use analysis for them, because who is the person that does? Who's the professional to hire to do a highest and best use analysis?
Well, the best person to do that is a real estate appraiser.
Well, a certain type of real estate appraiser. I think you would agree with me. You need a certified general real estate appraiser, and on top of that, the basic coursework, right, to just get your entry-level license of certified general will give you the concepts, but the advanced appraisal concepts that are taught in the course of becoming a MAI designated appraiser is really what's needed to do that type of analysis in complicated or large value commercial properties, especially if the assumption entered into, which should always be looked at, is that the current use may not be the highest and best use.
That's right. And it's very crucial also in appraising vacant land.
Sure.
This is where this is a fundamental step of the appraisal process, is to determine the highest and best use of that land.
Hilariously, everybody thinks vacant land is the easiest to appraise.
Unfortunately, yes, when you look at it, because you typically develop a sales approach, but
99% of the time, the only value is going to be its sales approached value. But sales as a what?
Yes, all of the other unknowns about vacant land is where you can stumble, because there are lots of unknowns with vacant land, and highest and best use is one of them. It's very crucial, especially in areas where zoning is a little vague. For you to be able to have a handle on what is the typical user doing, what is the typical site size, what is needed or required for water and sewer. I mean, there's a lot of things that have to be considered with vacant land, and determining the highest and best use, which will then determine what sales you use for comparables, which leads you to your concluded value. So it's really imperative that appraisers have a good grasp of those concepts, again, especially in markets like Alaska, where your zoning is kind of
often very permissive,
and where you might see a lot of transitional areas where there's some commercial, some residential. It's kind of a mixed thing, or just location to roads and that kind of thing that affect value.
Access is enormous,
right? So I mean, highest and best use is. It's oftentimes the crux of how the value is determined for vacant land. Two appraisers who have two different highest and best use for the same property are going to develop a different value.
Which leads into the next point that I wanted to make, which is you as an expert, not just in appraising real estate, but in reviewing the work of other appraisers, you being the only female in Alaska to hold the AI-GRS designation, but one of only are we still only two commercial real estate, any appraisers in Alaska with the AI-GRS designation, and the other one being retired. So you're the only practicing real estate appraiser in the state of Alaska who's licensed, well, not even just in the state, but licensed in this state, who holds the designation of AI-GRS. And if you don't know, that designation is granted through a similar process to the MAI by the Appraisal Institute. And what it means is a commercial appraiser who is able to scrutinize other commercial appraisers' work in the commercial realm of real estate. So there's another designation, the RRS, for residential work, which you can also do. That is a part of the AI-GRS, is residential also. But you're the only commercial appraiser in the state of Alaska, or again, licensed in the state of Alaska. There's a lot of people who actually come here to work and have a license here, but none of them have the AI-GRS either, at least as of today's recording. So kudos to you, pat on your back. I wish we got more work from it, but the reality is we don't. But so with that long spiel and promotion of the expert sitting next to me, what is one of the first things that you look at in reviewing an appraisal?
Well, the highest and best use is very critical,
everything.
And it is the way they develop the highest and best use will determine if they adequately address the issues involved with that property to get to choosing their comparables. So again, if your highest and best use isn't well defined or developed correctly,
right? If you screw up the legally permissible part, right, you may appraise it under the understanding that you can put some sort of a business there that can't be there.
Correct.
And as you might imagine, foundationally, that throws the entire appraisal off.
And it can make a very big difference in what comparable sales are used, what type of market rent you choose. It's
income
lots
potentials.
Of things. Yes. So it's very imperative that those things are understood, and especially commercial property. This is where it differs from the residential world. As in residential world, you're typically not going to see much deviation from highest and best use of.
It's still a part of residential appraising. It's still foundationally important, but it is a generally accepted theory practice that a residential use is likely to remain a residential use because the size and nature of improvements or lot sizes or development areas for residential tend to be surrounded by similar residential uses. So it's very easy to go down a road of assuming correctly.
Is, and 90% of the work that is done in residential is lending, and so therefore, typically it's going to be the highest and best use is residential. Right. Where you get into these issues of transitioning neighborhoods, where you see a good example of that is the properties around a hospital.
Sure.
Those single-family homes typically become doctor offices.
Yes, absolutely. This is
some kind of other medical service.
Illustrated in Homer right now. We're seeing conversions of residential to professional offices, which is a natural conversion.
It is.
It has previously happened in Soldotna extensively.
Yes, and it's very common in small communities.
I'm trying to think. Palmer. Did you? I don't think we saw it there because there was a lot of vacant land around it, so they were able to just develop from scratch there. Wasilla was already in a commercial location. As far as the clinic that was actually inside the city limits of Wasilla, but the hospital itself built outside of city limits in the Trunk Road realignment, which plug for Lydia again. Lydia did 90% of the appraisals for the condemnation work in that project in the complete realignment of Trunk Road. Right. So, and that's condemnation appraisal. It's another type of appraising that real estate appraisers can do. So. But
so that's, it's not that it does not come up in a residential appraising.
It comes up a lot in condemnation.
It comes up a lot in condemnation. And again, in vacant land. Right. So vacant land is especially crucial, again, to determine your highest and best use. Even when you start getting into zoning regulations and reading through those, that can put a lot of limitations on a property depending on the area.
Right. And our office did a second on a right-of-way condemnation inside of Anchorage, a very rare vacant land.
Right. Yes. Very rare.
A very rare vacant land being taken. I think, was it a highway expansion along Tudor Road there? Yeah. So
an interchange, really.
Interchange. Yeah. So, but the land had been vacant, and the property owner, who had been being approached had been trying to sell it for a long time. Yes. And was proposing a certain use. Yes. And so the state ended up having to do 2 appraisals. Of course, the first one didn't go very well. And so the state needed to hire a larger gun that was more qualified to do it. So then you come in. It's the process
of the state, but yes.
But what I'm getting at is, what I'm getting at ultimately was, when you're looking at the zoning, what was particular about that was the idea that they could apply for a change in zoning in order to accomplish a higher value if that zoning amendment or change
right,
would be allowed. And part of the appraiser's job, the competent appraiser, is to speak with those in charge of making those things to find out if that's even a thing.
Right.
And in that case, it wasn't.
It wasn't.
And you talked directly with the lead assessor for the city of Anchorage, who was adamant and firm that will never happen.
Well, yes. So the planning department, in this case, it depends on, the political influence at the time. Yeah. And currently in Anchorage, they are not rezoning from a certain use to a
I don't want to mention the uses, but there's a certain use that there's a shortage of.
Correct. And yes. So their point was that politically this would never fly because they're unwilling to make that change. Right. And so therefore it would probably be denied.
And so that became monumental by millions, changing the value of the property.
Of course. And
so that's where the importance is. The legally permissible aspect of highest and best use, if applied incorrectly, can affect the value of the property by millions. I'm thinking of another job where we were assisting an elderly gentleman who had owned a prime piece of real estate within the park of Denali.
Right.
And another, actually, I hesitate to use the word appraiser because the person who went out there is not actually licensed to appraise real estate in Alaska. It's just the preferred appraiser for a native corporation. They use unlicensed people because they do what they want. But the owner of the land hired us to go in and appraise that property. And the highest and best use had been incorrectly done. And again, $1.2 million difference in value, because the highest and best use was inappropriately done, which is no surprise because the person who performed the appraisal had never been trained in highest and best use analysis. So of course they get it wrong. You really should hire someone with a license to do those things.
Very crucial that you acknowledge the highest and best use.
Yeah. It might actually be nice if the state of Alaska would enforce professional licensing, because I know for a fact that person's been turned in at least twice for appraising real estate in Alaska without a license. And the state refuses to not only investigate, but prosecute. So,
yeah, it's unfortunate that this happens because, again, like you said, if you start out with two different highest and best uses, your values are most likely
going to be hugely off.
Very different. So it's imperative that is done and it's done well. And
done legally.
And like you point to, you take the steps necessary. So in cases where the typical buyer is going to say, hey, I needed this to be a different type of zoning that allows different uses or more broad uses.
Right.
I'm going to have to approach, a change here. So that's change is what they're willing to offer on a property.
That's something that the good real estate brokers, we have good ones here. We have some good ones, and they know in their local markets what the feasibility is of a change in zoning, because they're up on the real estate in their area and they're specialized. So,
in some cases, they've done it themselves. I spoke to many agents in the Anchorage area that have did that.
Well, in that one particular job, I think you talked to dozens of agents in addition to the city and the political figures involved.
And they pointed to the cost for one, which is
the cost of bribes.
Well, the cost in general of the
process.
Red tape.
There's a process,
but just
it's not all bribes.
It's also the time and then the small probability that it's approved.
Right.
So it's substantial concern when you're looking at vacant land and what its highest and best use is.
Well, fees and application costs, administrative costs are always a significant portion in the development of anything, right? And so they need to be factored into the valuation as well. Developers, whether they're developing from scratch or redeveloping, are all looking at the cost of permits and fees and delays in time to accomplish those things as well. Often you'll have to wait for a city council meeting or multiple layers processes. It can take years. And that's something that's common in the lower 48 that people take for granted. Developers there are adept at navigating that process or paying a fixer to get through the process. But in Alaska, it's not always a thing in a lot of places, but Fairbanks, Juneau, to some extent, Kenai, less so. They move pretty quickly. The city of Soldotna, we recently saw move in about 3 months. So, I mean, we're seeing some of the smaller communities can move quickly. Wasilla, we've seen them take 6 to 12 months. But the city of Anchorage, that's usually not less than 12 months.
It's a very long process, very costly process.
Yeah.
And honestly, it's surprising if anything even got done in the past 3 years, given the.
Well, I've noticed that interchange has not changed. So I don't know. I mean, we got paid. So that's in a nutshell why highest and best use is such a big deal.
Imperative.
And so if you're not familiar with that as a term, it's not just an appraisal concept. It's a real estate concept.
Yes. And it's something that, like you pointed to, agents are going to consider that, and
they should.
Potential buyers are always, especially developers that are looking at raw land. Yeah. They're all thinking about that. And it's imperative that appraisers understand that perspective and understand, the limitations of a property that can hinder its highest and best use. Yeah. In a lot of cases, in condemnation, you pointed out it's a very important to be addressed properly.
It's in USFLA. So if you're doing a yellow book,
yes,
it's going to talk about it in there.
Much more so, more stringent rules to that. So,
standards for federal land acquisitions. We're throwing out terms here. USFLA is U.S. federal
Uniform
land
Standards Appraisal Federal Land Acquisitions,
otherwise known as Yellow Book, because it used to be printed in a big yellow book, yellow covers. So that's a condemnation for federal lands or anything using federal money in the development of. So, which is often a lot of stuff in Alaska.
It's. And that's, and that's also for the federal government selling their own property as well.
Right, so. Right. No, USFLA standards or Yellow Book standards for appraisal are very important. They're used in a lot of areas. And so there's a good question, and we'll probably end after this, but how many appraisers, can just any appraiser do a USFLA appraisal?
Well, the short answer is no.
No. There is some very particular training that's required and a level of expertise and experience to get that, to be qualified to get to the training and then to pass the training.
Right.
And so
there is education, or a course to be, that you need to be familiar with Yellow Book rules. And yes, the detail that is required and the analysis that is required is very different than the typical appraisal.
Entry level.
Yes, it is much more scrutinized as far as the
federal reviewers
details that are required
are actually qualified and licensed to do it. Unlike in Alaska, where we have state reviewers that aren't qualified or licensed to review. So that alone, it's really easy to pass an appraisal off on the state because the level of competency of those reviewing it is, unless it's been contracted out, which they do a lot, often the ones working at the state aren't licensed to do it and don't know what they're doing anyway. So I said we'd be done with that. We're coming up on an hour. We're trying to keep these to under an hour. We appreciate your time. Thank you so much for tuning in. If you have a question for the show that you would like the most qualified appraiser in the state of Alaska to answer for you, we would be happy to do that. Send us an email to show, SHOW, at akcretoday.com. That's show at akcretoday.com. Thank you for joining us, and we'll see you next week.
Goodbye.